So thank you, everybody, for this opportunity. I'm grateful to crash yet another late medieval Spain conference. As an early medievalist, I was content simply chairing like I did back in 2018, which strikes me as impossibly long ago. It seems like just yesterday we were doing that, but I think COVID time is the fastest time of all in some ways. But anyway, then when I mentioned to Tom that this Paul Alvarus translation was in press essentially, or at least in the copy editing stages, he said, no, you have to talk about that. So it's going to be a case of that old 1, 2, skip a few, 99, 100, except in this case, instead of 1, 2, it's just going to be 1. Okay. I'm also grateful for the chance to introduce two up-and-coming potential graduate students of mine from the Lambs program at Pomona. Those of you who were here back in 2018 will remember Claire Dwyer, who's now pursuing graduate studies at Columbia. And I want to introduce Leslie Paz and Kevin Carlson, both from Pomona College, both juniors right now, and doing wonderful things. I hope you get a chance to chat with them during the breaks. Just a little background on this Alvarus paper. It was back in 2008 when I got a very kind invitation from two art historians, Christian Gruber and Avinoam Shalem, to come to Florence and contribute to a conference on images of the prophet. And it wasn't all going to be art images. Some of them were going to be textual, and that's where I came in because they remembered that I had actually worked on images of the prophet, early Latin biographies of the prophet from Spain. And so that's why they asked. At that time, I was finishing a project on my favorite poverty saint, Elizabeth of Hungary, which has nothing to do with our conference, but has a lot to do with me. Anyway, so I said yes, and I didn't realize then as I was putting aside the poverty saints and that going to Florence was the first step toward going really back to Córdoba and back to work that I had begun in the 1980s with the Cordoban martyrs and the dissertation and that first book. That's really where my independent academic life had begun. And now I came back as an older, maybe a wiser person. And somehow I felt like, I don't know if I was ready for it, but I felt less unready for actually engaging in a translation of those texts that contain everything we know about the martyrs of Córdoba. And so that's where the Eulogius Corpus book that Liverpool published in the Translated Texts for Historians series came from. And that was a long project in the midst of all kinds of other duties. It took forever. But as no sooner did that come out, then I thought, I really need to do Paul Alvarus too, because this one treatise, the Indiculus luminosus, fits right there, even though it wasn't written by Eulogius. And people had been asking for it for a long time. And I thought, while I'm up on the idiom in some sense, having just slogged through everything related to Eulogius, I thought this is the best chance to do it. One of the reasons why the Indiculus luminosus is particularly went so long without being translated, I mean, even beyond Eulogius in a sense, is that it was always had the reputation of being a notoriously difficult text. And when I dove into it, finally, I sort of felt that same way too, and I treated it with great trepidation, just dipping into it now and then. I realized that it wasn't really Alvarus's Latin that was the problem. It's the fact that he refers so indirectly to so many things. I mean, my goodness, if he were any one of our students, we would have marked him down right and left. It's almost as if he were writing for some sort of reading group of dhimmi Christians living in Córdoba that had been together long enough to basically know the backstories on everything they're talking about. Like that old joke about the comedians who know all the jokes, the comedian convention, and they know all the jokes by number, and they stand up and just tell the number and they all laugh, right? And yet someone from the outside wouldn't really know what to do with that. And that's a bit what happens when you dig into Alvarus. So some of his allusions remain opaque, lost, I guess, and maybe they're never going to be recovered, but most of them became clear to me as I began translating that text and began really to appreciate the way that Alvarus's mind worked. And like I tell my students in my medieval Latin workshop, both Leslie and Kevin are in that right now, along with 10 other students, that when you translate obscure texts, you're effectively bringing someone back from the dead, or to use maybe a more timely metaphor based on the Coco movie, you're saving the departed from that other kind of death, the death of being forgotten. And these texts, a lot of them truly would be in a sense, because so few people can manage them anymore in their original languages. And plus, as someone from Pomona College, I deal with undergraduates. We expect them to learn Latin, but we don't expect them to master it. And so translated text for historians, a great shout out for them. The first time I contributed, I think it was volume 9, way back in 1990-ish, and now we're up to the mid-70s. It's quite impressive what they've done for, again, late antique, early medieval people. So this Indiculus luminosus is divided into two almost equal halves. The second half is the more famous part in a way, because it contains a very early attempt to try to describe Muhammad as the fulfillment of Old Testament and some New Testament prophecies about Antichrist. And I'm not aware of anything earlier in any language that did that in as systematic and as sustained a way, though there were many references to him being Antichrist along the way. The other part of that that's even more famous is the very last couple of paragraphs of that, where you have Alvarus's famous lament, where he bemoans the fact that so many Christian youths are growing up and learning Arabic rather than learning Latin, and the implication that that would be the first step toward losing a generation of students, essentially, to not just Arabic, but potentially to Islam. And that was troubling to him. That's been quoted 1,000 times. And if you're aware of anything in Alvarus's work, that's what you'd be aware of. But the first half is dedicated to a defense of those so-called Córdoban martyrs from the 850s. And so it parallels what we get in Eulogius in the two martyrologies that he wrote. They begin with long prefaces that do similar things, similar but not the same, it turns out. And that's the part of the Indiculus luminosus that gets lost in the shuffle, and that's the part that I want to share with you today. And really, until I set out to translate it, I always thought that it would be just a derivative text, that it would essentially mimic what Eulogius had done in the first of his treatises. The second one hadn't been written yet. So anyway, for the sake of jogging your memories, if you had the chance to read it, or establishing some common ground for questions and answers in a moment, I thought I would just hit a couple of salient points, certainly not all of them, but some that jumped out to me. So a close reading of the Indiculus luminosus is a wonderful way to explore the challenges that the Roman Church faced whenever it found itself thrust back into a pre-Constantinian mode, right? This happened probably first with the Nestorians, who were, in a sense, pushed out of the empire in the 5th century and found a home in the Persian Empire. And they were able then to live a different kind of Christianity, one that did not pretend, at least directly, to have political power. So in a sense, one could say the Nestorians were more consistent with the early pre-Constantinian church than with the Latin church, or the Greek church for that matter, after Constantine. You could also argue then that in subsequent centuries, not long after that, with the rise of Islam, that all of the Christians, including the Nestorians now, who found themselves under Islamic rule, also found themselves thrust back into a pre-Constantinian Christian modality, and that made all the difference in the way that their Christianity developed over that time. And the fact that the Muslims seem to have borrowed the whole dhimmi system for dealing with subject populations from the Persians to begin with, and then modified it, only adds to the sense that there's consistency there. So what wisdom from the pre-Constantinian church then might subject communities of Christians to Islam benefit from, right? So one of the big ones that we think probably accounts for most of the learning from pre-Constantinian primordial narratives about what the church was back then, again, not necessarily how it was, but how it was remembered, is that whole idea of rendering unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God. That worked presumably around the year 100 in Christian history, when those words were probably written, maybe a little bit before, maybe a little after. And it would have probably appealed to a lot of Christians living under Muslim rule, a kind of a political apathy approach that seemed consistent. In other words, under Islamic rule, they were in a sense living in a revived Roman imperial context, let's say pre-prosecution of Christians. So the moral of that story then would be that you would follow the laws of the land as long as those laws did not force you to compromise your Christianity. And more specifically, you would put up with dhimmi-based restrictions, which at the same time they restricted you, also protected your right to remain a Christian, and then put up with the other annoyances of being a religious minority, even if you are the majority, demographically speaking, that would come along the way. But there's another pre-Constantinian Christian primordial narrative, and that's the narrative of martyrdom. And that would suggest, if you were to follow that path, okay, and we figured that only a few are going to do that, just as only a few did it way back when, then you're going to have to imagine that Islamic rule is a threat to Christianity. And you're going to imagine that dying for the faith has to do with a rejection of the Islamic domination of Christianity that would then parallel more the pre-Constantinian experience of the prosecuted/persecuted church. That presupposes that Islam would play the role of persecutor, whether they would play it or not, by the way. And one might argue that the Romans never really played the role of persecutor either. That was thrust upon them, right? They were prosecuting criminals, and the Christians were interpreting prosecution as persecution. So just some key takeaways from that first thought, that the struggle between the would-be martyrs of Córdoba and their Christian critics really is a struggle between two primordial narratives, each rooted in the pre-Constantinian Christian legacy. They both defended their positions and defended them well from the very same text, which we call the Christian Bible. And the tension between them, therefore, is reminiscent of the tension that we see in the early 3rd century in a different part of the Mediterranean, in Carthage, where we have the works of Tertullian. Like Tertullian, Alvarus, and Eulogius, they're intent on painting a black and white set of choices for Christians whose religious identity, in fact, and their negotiations of that identity, represent every possible shade of gray. You can really be misled by taking these texts at face value. You have to hold them up to the light, upside down and backwards. Play the LP backwards. Paul is dead, and you'll finally hear all the things that you're not hearing because nobody's writing about those things, yet we can read them between the lines in texts like Alvarus's Indiculus luminosus. Let me also take a second to unpack the title between blasphemers and whisperers. So blasphemers is not a term that Alvarus or Eulogius actually used in reference to those Christians who blasphemed Muhammad and were executed for it in the 850s. It's actually a term that would describe how the Muslims would have imagined these Christians, hotheads who were executed for violating the law of the land. Eulogius and Alvarus's term for blasphemers was martyrs, right? Whisperers, susurrones, is a term that at least Eulogius used, not Alvarus, it turns out, but I'll explain why I'm using it in this case, when he described those Christians who rejected the new martyrs as something that should be venerated or emulated. Eulogius called them whisperers because he wanted to draw attention to the fact that even those Christians who criticized the martyrs were actually engaged in their own disparagement of the Islamic faith. They were just doing it more softly, in safe spaces, their own homes, presumably, but also in their churches. In other words, same content. Christians, in some ways, have to denounce Islam by being Christians in a way, otherwise we would think they might gravitate towards simply becoming Muslims. But whether they do it in public or privately is going to depend, it's going to have a big difference, right? Janina Safran and Adriano Duque help us understand what Eulogius was talking about. Safran says, dhimmi Christians were, quote, free to say, Muhammad is your prophet, but Jesus or Moses is ours. They could not, however, deny the truth of the Shahada. He who insults the prophet violates the covenant of protection. So in other words, you can assert your Christianity to some degree, that's who you are, and there's an expectation that therefore you're being critical of other traditions that you are not, but only implicitly, right? And Duque says, he was talking about how a Malacite jurist, quote, distinguished between two kinds of insult, an outright attack against Islam made with ill intent and therefore punishable by death, and a simple declaration of one's own religion. In this last case, he goes on, the Christian could not be held accountable for this offense. Alvarus didn't use this word whisper, but he did provide the only justification really that we have for its use, even though it's relatively easy to figure out in some ways. He provides a liturgical context that makes sense out of Eulogius' use of the term by going to the biblical book of Tobit or Tobias 13:12. That quotation, cursed be all those who spurn you, in reference to Jerusalem, but really now in reference to the New Jerusalem of Christianity or Jesus or Christian thought, and all who blaspheme you. Cursed be all those who hate you, and all who will say a hard word against you. Cursed be all those who demolish you, and all who destroy your walls, and all who overturn your towers, and all who burn your houses. This was a part of what we call the Mozarabic liturgy of Córdoba at that time. And on the eve of Epiphany, Christians would recite this liturgically, right? And Alvarus says this, he said, every year the church shouts out this very curse against those hating it. This being the case, reasoned Alvarus, and by extension Eulogius, how could any Christian be so hard on the blasphemers who simply took that cursing out into the streets? They were fundamentally doing the same thing. Alvarus's strategy of highlighting this part of the liturgy, first to show that the blasphemers and the whisperers, that they were both subsets of Christians who understandably cursed, though in two different ways, the Islamic world around them and Muhammad the Prophet. Second, though, going beyond that, after establishing common ground, he then says, but the path of the whisperer is the lesser of the two paths. In fact, it is a flaccid path compared to the kind of militance of the martyrs. So he uses that to demonize the whisperers for not only embodying a private and safe form of cursing Islam, one that's not going to get them in trouble, and therefore they lose credit for that, but also publicly cursing the martyrs. In other words, not publicly cursing Islam, but the Christians turning around and publicly cursing those Christians who are publicly cursing Islam. It starts to be like the sound of one hand clapping, okay? But that was his problem. And this led to one of the most remarkable passages in the Indiculus luminosus. He says, and there's little gems like this everywhere, although this is one of the best ones. He says, although this will seem to everyone reading this text to be a sacrilege, if there is so great an adversary, in other words, Antichrist, may he curse that holy church that every day curses those who curse him. I'm going to read that again. If there is an Antichrist, may he curse that holy church that every day curses those who curse him. That one line is so deep in reference to Tobit, in reference to the context there, etc. Anyway, this is why Alvarus spends so much time in the selection that I gave you, essentially on the subject of cursing Islam and its role in the Bible, how it's rooted in the Bible, all kinds of Old Testament figures who had holy cruelty, right, in their approaches to the world around them, and how this was then reinterpreted by the apostles as a militant form of preaching, a form of preaching where no matter what, you would preach to the ends of the earth. He brushed aside the idea that the apostles would sort of back off if there was pressure or persecution. Just no, it has to go from coast to coast. And not only that, when you do that, you either save souls or you establish debtors to the faith. In other words, there was no thought on his part that many Muslims would convert to Christianity. But if they didn't know about Christianity, or more accurately, did not have it actively preached to them, they could never be held responsible if they went then before judgment at the end of time. Well, you never heard the story, I guess you're off the hook. So establishing the kind of snarky part of Christian missionary activity is establishing debtors of the faith who, once they've heard about it, have no real choice. And the other thing I'll just say real quickly is one part of this text which shows Alvarus's real deep knowledge of Islam. There's so much in there that I could talk about, especially in the second portion, and then also in Eulogius's text as well. But at one point, he's critiquing Christians who believe that under certain circumstances, you're allowed to dissemble or pretend that you're something you're not in order to avoid being harassed or prosecuted or something like that. It'd be tantamount to if you were a Christian in Tertullian's time claiming you weren't a Christian, okay, you just happen to be having a beer with one, and could you please not force me to sacrifice, etc. He says, are not our very men, that is Christians, in this case court Christians probably, operating within the government in Córdoba, but Christians, who serve at their command in the palace ministry, openly implicated in their errors, made foul by their stenches, they actually consider themselves to be resplendent when, for instance, they do not perform their prayers openly in the presence of the pagans, meaning the Muslims, when they yawn and do not safeguard their foreheads with the sign of the cross. And then finally, and most interesting, when they, their words having been put to flight, do not publicly refer in their presence to Christ as God, declaring him to be the word of God and a spirit instead, as they themselves assert, in other words, as Muslims assert, while keeping their own confessions in their hearts on the grounds that God will eventually examine and exonerate them for this little act of dissembling. What he's referring to is Surah 4, 171. People of the book, do not go to excess in your religion and do not say anything about God except the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was nothing more than a messenger of God, his word directed to Mary, and a spirit from him. We know in Eastern texts that there were Eastern Christians who looked at this passage of the Bible and said, see, there's a reference to the Trinity there that the Muslims missed, even though it's a muddled reference, because they're talking about the word and they're talking about spirit, etc. Typically words referring to Jesus and referring to the Holy Spirit. But in this case, it's being used quite differently and uniquely, I believe. And that is as a criticism of Alvarus's criticism of how Christians have managed to avoid standing out in a crowd, especially at the court level. They're not going to draw a lot of attention to themselves by saying their prayers publicly. They're not going to cross themselves when they yawn. And when they refer to Jesus and Jesus in general, they're going to talk about him as a word, and they're going to talk about the Holy Spirit as spirit, and they're going to let it go at that. In other words, influenced by the contents of that surah for the way they're even imagining their own Christology. And I will leave it at that and open it to questions.
Thank you.